Good afternoon. My name is George Perkovich. I'm a Vice President for Studies here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and have the honor of being the Japan Chair for a World Without Nuclear Weapons. My pleasure this afternoon to be the host of Assistant Secretary of State Mallory Stewart. And I'm especially excited because I think she and the administration are attempting to do some interesting things in the arms control space. And as we all know, that is not a topic that captures a whole lot of interest and attention these days. In fairness, there have been a lot of interesting things happening that are more dramatic and easier to understand. But we thought we'd use the time and have a conversation and then open it up for a discussion with you all and people that are watching via the internet to explore any number of issues that you all might want to. I want to start the conversation at I think a more general level and that addresses kind of the underlying political relationships and perceptions between primarily the U.S. and China. We'll talk about somewhat the U.S. And Russia, because I think it's easy to get immediately into the weeds of how many weapons and what kinds of systems, and I want to step back a little bit. In the last couple of days, there's been, some reporting or news that China has kind of disagreed with the U.S. argument that China has rejected arms control discussions with the U.S. and China has said, no, that isn't the issue so much as that the U.S. is doing things that are an affront to our security or endangering our security, and we can't talk under those circumstances. And there was recently a very good article by a friend of ours, Brad Roberts, in the Washington Quarterly that came at this from a different perspective. And I'm going to quote Brad. He says, Presidents Putin, Xi, and Kim have all rejected the efforts of the United States to address nuclear dangers through dialogue, diplomacy, and arms control. And so that's a common view, that this administration has wanted to have such dialogue, and those have been rejected. And so I guess the opening question I would ask Mallory is what's your perspective on whether the U.S. is offering and they're refusing, or their view the U.S. is doing things that make it impossible for them to accept dialogue on arms control?
Yeah, first, thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for coming. Really, really glad to be having this conversation. But to your question, it's clearly a perception challenge between us. Our clearly felt position is that we are constantly offering, especially China, to engage in a conversation to reduce the risks that are growing in our relationship. We have offered repeatedly in the past to engage with Russia as well as to engage with the DPRK. And Brad Roberts is not wrong in that the vast majority of our offers have been rejected. And what I'm fascinated by is this idea that Russia really had first put on the table, that we have to agree to their security demands before they will meet with us on arms control, which is fascinating, right? To say, we will not meet with you on any risk reduction or arms control until you give us what we want. And they use the terms that actually others have started using now of indivisible security, of, some allegation that we don't appreciate or respect their security concerns, which of course we want to engage to understand and to sort of explain why we have different perceptions and understand what is in the realm of the possible with respect to reducing risks. But Russia very clearly, upon its departure from the January 22 last strategic stability engagement that Deputy Secretary Sherman ran with the Russians, and very clearly said, we are willing to walk through your purported treaty on indivisible security that they gave in December of 2021, we would walk through each article and explain why things were or were not in the realm of the possible from our perspective, but try to understand where they're coming from on these issues. But the comment at the table was, we need to continue this conversation. The US side was saying we need to continue risk reduction and arms control and understand how we prevent destabilization and arms racing, and you need to not go forward with your invasion of Ukraine. And the commitment at the table was, we are not going to invade Ukraine, and quite frankly, the allegation that the US side was being hysterical and suggesting that that was going to happen. Less than a month later, of course, the Ukrainian invasion went forward. But we followed up, right? Understanding the concern there that the commitment from the Russians at the table were that they weren't going to go forward with the invasion, which then happened, challenging the credibility and the accountability of those sitting at the table. We then had subsequent opportunities after that to reach out to them and say, we need to discuss New START, which they, from our perspective, illegally suspended. We need to discuss constraints on our nuclear arsenal. We need to understand how we prevent, an unbridled and unconstrained arms race. In June of 2023, National Security Advisor Sullivan said we will engage with Russia and China without preconditions, but there has to be some accountability, right? We can't have a situation where you come to the table and you say, we won't invade, and then you invade a month later. So we reached out then, we sent them a non-paper in September, which laid out some possible risk reduction methods that could at least allow for some transparency, some confidence building measures, and begin a conversation of next steps in the New START context to look forward to 2026, when we will have no remaining bilateral treaties with respect to our strategic arsenal. So we put this on the table. All of this was rejected by Russia. Russia came back 3 months later and said, no, not until you agree to our demand, essentially, to stop supporting Ukraine. China most recently, I just saw their comment that they would engage with anyone on arms control, but that there was a challenge for them to engage with the United States while we were doing things that were not in the Chinese interest. I think from our perspective, we need to have risk reduction conversations. We need to understand, with China especially, their positions better so that we can actually move forward to building trust and building confidence, building measures in a way that is more informed. And the order that they're putting in doesn't make sense to us, that you have to agree to our demands or agree to our perception of how you're destabilizing the security environment before we'll meet with you on risk reduction to discuss how we can collectively help build a security environment that addresses both of our concerns. It's a challenging order that they're placing things in. And I'm not trying to equate the two, but I'm saying it's a concern to me that we've seen this evolution in the thinking of risk reduction and even arms control more broadly, that it can somehow be used as a leverage point as opposed to something that's in the interests of the countries that are engaging with it, of our own interests, right? Arms control, risk reduction, prevention of unintentional escalation, and prevention of miscalculation, misunderstanding is in every country's interest. But to say you have to agree to some demand, such as withdrawing from your support for Ukraine, which we will not do, before we will engage with you on risk reduction or arms control, diminishes your appreciation for the value of arms control to your own national security, right? And that's the concern. So I don't think Brad Roberts is incorrect, and I think it's an evolution in thinking about the value of arms control and risk reduction to countries themselves for their own national security purposes versus using it as a leverage point to achieve objectives that may not be collectively agreed upon, but somehow are seen as these security requirements before even engaging on a conversation, if that makes sense.
There are all sorts of historical traces of this thinking. So for a long time, early in the Cold War, the Soviet question was, would the U.S. accept parity, or did the U.S. insist on supremacy and superiority? And that wasn't clear for a long time. China, for quite some time now, has been saying, does the U.S. accept a relationship of mutual vulnerability with China, or does it seek superiority? And the U.S. hasn't really answered that. question. But it strikes me that what you're talking about now is both China and Russia wondering or perceiving that the U.S. policy towards them is regime change fundamentally. And there are those in Washington and in the past administration and maybe in an administration next year who argue just that. Arms control is ridiculous with evil regimes. You have to get rid of them. And we shouldn't be negotiating with them. We should be removing them through greater strength and all of that. So are they even communicating enough so that this administration and people like you could kind of pick up on and answer that? Or is it so vague and the opportunity to engage is so small that you can't even try to pull on the thread and say, what is it you're really trying to get at here?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there's many different perceptions of what the U.S. is trying to do or not trying to do. I think from our perspective, with Russia especially, we have learned from our years of engagement, from our engagement with them during the Cold War, where, by the way, we were at each other's throats, right? We were in a situation where there was no love lost between either side when we realized, in large part because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that this was not to either of our advantages to be in a situation where we were forced into an escalation dynamic. And it was exactly because we didn't see eye to eye, exactly because we were at each other's throats, that risk was the greatest, that we saw the need, and President Kennedy and subsequent leaders and professionals saw the need to reduce that risk and to engage. And so, the idea that the U.S. somehow is throwing that out and thinking that it's not arms control to reduce risk, but it's arms control to change regime is inconsistent with that history that we have, right? I mean, there were those back then, I'm sure, that wanted regime change as well, but that was not the intent of the arms control engagement. That was not the intent of the TCBMs and the risk reduction that we developed as a result of that crisis. And I think, I would argue that we've been very clear. Our intent, especially with China on engagement, is for risk reduction and risk prevention. And we proposed in our November 2023 engagement some opportunities for greater risk reduction to show these are the kind of things we're talking about. We think these are, beneficial. Missile launch notifications, right? We understand they have such an agreement with China. The idea that we can engage on emerging security challenges or emerging security domains in a more sort of neutral way to share sort of combined threats that we face, right? Those concepts. And we have tried to be very clear. Now, of course, the U.S. has lots of different opinions in lots of different corners, and often countries can hear what they want to hear. But I think that this administration has been very clear that we seek to engage on issues with China that are in our mutual interest to engage on, reducing the risks of miscalculation and misunderstanding, understanding why they perceive certain things to be aggressive, and we perceive certain things on their part to be aggressive, and understanding how we sort of work to a better place on those positions, right? And why, their assertions with respect to extended deterrence, they see it as offensive, and we see it very much as inclined to defend the interests and the security interests and the very seriously felt risks that those countries face from North Korea and difficult tensions in the region. So these are the conversations we need to have, and we've been trying to be very clear.
Let's talk about China especially, because it strikes me that that's in many ways a harder challenge, harder historically, because for quite some time, U.S. administrations have wanted to draw China into dialogue on whether it's nuclear risk reduction or arms control. And China for a long time said, look, depending when it was, we have a small arsenal and assessments where it was like 300, and you have 1,700 deployed strategic weapons, 5,000 total. We have no first use. You have a policy that doesn't preclude first use. So what is it you want us, China, to put on the table? You should come down to our level and change your policy to no first use, and then tell us what you want to talk about after that. We never had a response to that. the U.S. really, that would say, well, here's what we're prepared to offer that, given your perspective. Now they're building up rapidly by the Pentagon's publications. So is there an assessment that they want to build up to a point where then they would feel more confident? Is there a thought about what the U.S. might offer to preclude that or to make that buildup less compelling? When you all think about if they said yes to talks, what would you put on the table?
Mm-hmm. Well, and we already have put some stuff on the table. They haven't said yes yet, but certainly we have wanted to talk to them, and we've offered very much to talk to them about our nuclear policy and why we feel it's necessary to, support extended deterrence from a nonproliferation arms control perspective, and from many other reasons. We've offered to talk to them again about the value of preventing misunderstanding and miscalculation in launching, right? Again, these were the things we put on the table with them. We have actually even suggested we want to talk more fully about their no first use proposal, because we don't understand how it's consistent with their refusal to talk to us about their nuclear buildup, about their launch on warning capacities, about all of the things we see that they're doing that they haven't acknowledged and they aren't willing to talk to us about. And it's not that we intend to change our nuclear policy, but we need to understand where this proposal is coming from. Is it just an opportunity for them to somehow deflect attention from their nuclear buildup? Is it an opportunity for them to deflect attention from their clear obligations under Article 6 of the NPT, just as we all, the nuclear weapon states on the NPT have agreed to these Article 6 requirements to work to prevent arms racing and to diminish the salience of nuclear weapons. Is there no first use proposal, is it real, or is it just a political fig leaf? And if it is real, then engage with us to understand how we are expected to trust it in an environment which trust has been diminished, which they acknowledge, right? And they have talked about a step-by-step approach to building trust. But what we propose to them on confidence-building measures and transparency and other approaches needs to get us to a place where we can take and fully understand their proposal as something that would be credible. And in this environment where there's no engagement, there's no willingness to discuss step-by-step building towards a better relationship, it's very hard to take that proposal seriously. So I look forward to hearing from them. They put something on the table with respect to the NPT conversations, and we're looking into that. But in a bilateral conversation or even in the P5 context, how we get beyond the challenges that we have right now in talking about the realities we see from open source reporting of their buildup that they deny, of the realities we've heard from their cooperation and coordination with Russia on certain capabilities, and how we get to a place where we can even trust an assertion of no first use when they're not willing to discuss the questions.
But why not just say, yeah, we'll go to your talks on no first use, no conditions. Let's
absolutely. And in fact, we've said that. We've said we'll engage with you, no conditions, right? But there has to be accountability. And I'm hoping in the P5 context, we can have some broader conversations. I would like to engage on risk reduction with China bilaterally and understand further. And I've said to others, please help us address this with China, and let's engage on what this no first use proposal of yours really means. Again, not from the point of view that we are planning on changing our nuclear posture, but from the point of view of understanding what the proposal entails, understanding how they can feel comfortable with that proposal in an environment where there's lack of transparency of their capabilities, and how they think the proposal should be taken seriously when they're not willing to engage with us on our questions. So,
I mean, I'd rather be China in this one. In terms of arguing it, they had a long-standing declaratory policy of no first use and a force that matched that nearly perfectly. For 6 decades, they had a tiny nuclear force that people here would have had a stroke in the Pentagon thinking about having that kind of force facing the U.S. with all its capability and Russia on its border and everything else. They kept saying, you build down, we have this policy. And we just ignored them and deflected it. And then categorically, the U.S. basically has rejected no first use, saying, no, we're not going to do it. And we say, theirs isn't serious, but it shouldn't be serious because, we think no first use would be dangerous. And so now they make a proposal. And so if we would engage them on that with the precondition that everybody knows that there's no way the U.S. would ever agree to no first use, that the rest of the world would kind of take China's side on this. So they're in a nice position in terms of kind of international politics on this, given the size of the U.S. arsenal and the policy that the U.S. has always had. So it's hard to see what would make them want to get off that position, which is internationally pretty nice for them politically.
Yeah, I can see how the argument would be it's nice for them. I think the challenge is that they have not admitted to what open source has provided us, as well as the Pentagon, that their rapid buildup. They have not acknowledged that. They have not engaged with us on efforts to reduce risk, on efforts to understand how we work to prevent arms racing. They are a limitless, they have a limitless partnership with Russia, who has, nuclear saber rattled, certainly, and has exacerbated the international security environment. And in all of our efforts to engage with them on no first use, I'm just struck by their focus on speaking those words to the international community, saying we're willing to engage with everyone, but we won't engage with the U.S. until they change, whatever behavior they demand of us. And it's challenging to see how we can really take seriously this proposal when. Are they going to convince Russia to stop their nuclear saber rattling? Are they going to, in the P5 context, be transparent with respect to the very minimal, efforts that we've tried to make in that arena to try to push forward transparency and risk reduction in a positive way? And quite frankly, we don't see how their growth in their nuclear arsenal and their growing triad capacities and their launch-arm warning are entirely consistent and should be just taken at face value with a no first use assertion. And so we would like to understand that. We would like them to explain it to us. I don't think they could say we would enter into a discussion with them with the precondition that we won't change anything. I think our discussions with them are truly to understand what they're suggesting is in the realm of the possible and to understand why they think this is a credible assertion and could be a credible assertion across the P5 when there's an extreme, as they've pointed out, lack of trust right now.
How big a problem is it that the people that you're generally engaging with and that are making the proposal, for example, on no first use, may have no idea what China's capabilities are, what the thinking is behind it? In other words, they don't have the information to answer those very good questions. How big a problem is it? And this used to be, historically, was a problem with the Soviet foreign ministry when U.S. negotiators would go to negotiate. And the Soviet diplomats had no idea what Soviet forces were and ended up having to rely on the U.S. to tell them what they had in the negotiations. How does that work?
It's one of the reasons that when we had our engagement in November, we brought our Department of Defense colleagues, we brought our Department of Energy colleagues, we brought our NSC colleagues and our interagency colleagues that could have relevant information for the conversation. We were not matched on the other side, but it is one of the reasons you've seen the U.S. constantly say, we want to have these engagements with the PLA. We want to have a broader conversation with those that have the underlying information, because we want to make sure that if we see something through open source or our Pentagon reports on something that we believe to be true, that others are on the other side that can either credibly say, we know this not to be true and provide information to that effect, or can say, we have a basis to talk from an informed standpoint. And I think the challenge has been, if they're not willing to send their representative interagency, that the concern is that they may not have an equivalent sort of approach to these topics or the background on the particular issues. I'm very happy in interagency conversations, that we engage on with with China to say, I defer to my interagency colleagues on particular issues. They have greater expertise, and that really should be what we hope would be reflected on the other side of the table.
Yeah, and it's not. That's a big problem. Again, historically, one of the ways that initiated some progress on that was direct correspondence between the head of state to the head of state, but it was always secret. Writing letters, going back from Kennedy, and I'm not going to ask whether that's happening. But this is not an original problem, and it takes the boss ultimately to get the people who know stuff to tell the other people enough of what they need to know to have a conversation with you like that. And our system works better in terms of sharing like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in leading up to this conversation, we had talked to what our objectives are with China. And I really think the hope is that we could have engagement on risk reduction. They could see the value in their own system of preventing miscalculation and misunderstanding and unintentional escalation, because we've had that in the course of our relationship. And the engagement doesn't have to have any formal arms control attached to it, but certainly risk prevention, crisis communications, those concepts that are appreciated within their own system, right? Missile launch notifications is something they do with Russia, is my understanding. So there's an acknowledgement of a need for growing a level of trust between us that the Chinese have raised with us. We hope that there is an opportunity to engage. And not to say we won't engage with you unless you do what we say in another context, because that's not sort of where arms control or risk reduction should be. It should not be a leverage point and a bargaining chip. It should be an opportunity to share perceptions, understand where each other are coming from, and understand if there's a path forward towards reducing risk.
What do you, when you think about, because you're a senior arms control official, and often people are interested in legally binding agreements if you can get there. How do you think about the United States or Washington's capacity to actually complete legally binding agreements anymore? And in the absence of that, then what is it that we're to do? And there are a lot of people who work in think tanks and research institutions now, and I think scrambling, trying to figure out, okay, if you can't have treaties, then what do you do, and how do you do these things? How do you think about that? You're in the middle of all this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the community has to be more creative, more flexible, build general understandings. I think we've done this historically in this community, where prior to the Outer Space Treaty, 5 years before, we had a UN General Assembly conversation about the terrible risks of placing nuclear weapons in outer space, right, in orbit around the Earth. And then we eventually got to a treaty on it. We did it in the development of the Chemical and the Biological Weapons Convention, right? We can develop general understandings, appreciations, normative approaches until we get to a level of community agreement that these are things that should be embedded, and that there's enough transparency or at least verification capacity, they could be embedded in a legally binding agreement. I think one of the greatest disadvantages of the very strongly felt perception of the United States government, and I think the majority of the world right now, that Russia has walked away from so many treaties, is that how do you engage in a possible legally binding in the future with a government that has so willingly violated? In the case of the INF, right, we talked to them for 6 years before we ultimately withdrew from that treaty to try to convince them this was not in their interest. Their 9M729 was a violation in our perception, explained to them why we thought this was a violation. We went through the process to try to convince them this was not in their interest to withdraw from, to violate, and then it forced their unwillingness to accept that, forced us to withdraw, right? And so now we have an environment, including in the New START context, where various different justifications provided for their suspension, but they suspended, and they, indicated a lack of interest in complying with that treaty going forward. Though I am hopeful that we can maintain our political commitments to abide by the caps as long as each side is complying with that. They're walking away from the Chemical Weapons Convention very clearly in their use of chemicals in numerous contexts, but especially with respect to their attempted assassination of the Skripals and then Navalny and their potential continuing use of chemical weapons in the Ukraine context. Their willingness to walk away from all these treaties has made the idea of arms control treaties with Russia very hard for anyone really to swallow at this point. But I think building international appreciation for the importance of normative commitments on anything that we can sort of get to a consensus is a stability concern. And recent examples are the 2022 UN General Assembly resolution on preventing or prohibiting direct descent destructive ASAT testing, right? Trying to minimize the intentional creation of debris in the outer space environment. Our 2023 UN General Assembly resolution prohibiting the use of radiological weapons that is feeding into a conference on disarmament discussion on potentially prohibiting radiological weapons in a legal context. So building norms into potentially treaties in that arena, trying to work to develop norms of responsible behavior in the gray zones of emerging technologies and emerging security domains to build appreciation for why it would be stabilizing, to have a more predictable environment, have more predictable rules of responsible behavior to hopefully build towards something that we can then place in a legally binding context. And these are active and ongoing conversations, even in the multilateral arena with Russia and China when we think about the space arena and the ongoing open-ended working groups. They're still going. It's just a very hard environment right now for legally binding, especially when there's no clear consensus on what the underlying definitions would be, right? The definition of a weapon in space is very hard for anyone to give when any sort of satellite could be used offensively or defensively.
Two more questions, and I want to open it up. One is kind of on the news in a sense. So the U.S. and NATO ministers announced that the U.S. by 2026 will be deploying intermediate range missiles to Europe, especially Germany. And those are systems that had been prohibited under the INF Treaty, which, as you said, Russia violated, we withdrew from. What's interesting to some people about that is that announcement of a deployment didn't have any kind of companion mention of the possibility of arms control or alternatives to the deployment, which is then harkens back to the 1979 decision to deploy INF into Europe, but with a dual-track approach that ultimately led to the INF Treaty. Was there any consideration given to pairing the announcement of the deployment with some kind of offer and someone rejected it, or was it, given the war in Ukraine, it was just, no, we're going to deploy this and we're not going to even think about tying it to potential arms control?
Yeah, I mean, from the U.S. government's perspective, we've been very clear that we are open to risk reduction arms control engagements with both China and Russia, again, as our national security advisor was clear on. We, again, had sent to Russia in September of 2023 proposals. We had discussed with Russia back in January before the invasion of why there is a challenge for them in the absence of the INF, right? They had proposed a moratorium. We had talked about the challenges with that moratorium, especially when their INF violating missile, as we view it, is already deployed and is part of their forces. We also have heard recently, and I think John Kirby said it recently, that some of the DPRK missiles that Russia is using have gone to the 900-kilometer range, are potentially capable of violating INF limits. So, these are concerns that they're aware we have, and we've raised it with them. We've told them that in the absence of the INF, it would actually be a challenge for their security as well as the entire European arena to have these missiles be part of an arms race. So we feel that we've been engaging with them and explaining to them why having some type of limitation on arms racing in this particular context is in their interest as well as ours. This particular announcement went forward in the form that it did, and I think our understanding is that we have been very clear that we are open to figuring out how we minimize the risks of these issues with them. And I think the more relevant part is that they've constantly said, we will do what we're going to do, and we're going to ignore your concerns, and then blame on you when we want to continue doing the actions that we've already taken, right? They had been violating the INF. They continued to violate it in the face of our challenges. They then have continued potentially to use DPRK missiles that could also go to INF ranges, and yet they are now saying that it's this deployment that leads them to finally take an additional step, which of course we view them as taking all along. Yeah, so it's one of those narrative challenges, of course, but we feel we've been very clear that even in our NPR, that we see arms control and deterrence going hand in hand. I would also say not two sides of the same coin, but an interwoven fabric of interrelated issues and certainly perceptions being tied to each other and challenging the security and assurance equations in many fronts. And we've been clear with them. And so there's only so many times we can go back out to them and say, here we are again, suggesting that it's in your interest to engage with us on risk reduction.
So my last question, we'll open it up. So you've been on this job roughly 3 years, and everything you're describing is, a fair departure from the environment of the preceding 25 years in terms of what's happening with China, with the Ukraine war, all of this. So what's been the biggest surprise for you as a senior arms control official in a U.S. administration now?
I mean, I think it goes back to the beginning a little bit of our conversation, which is I am surprised that there's been this reversal in willingness to engage in risk reduction and arms control from a perspective of what we've heard from Russia most clearly, but even recently from China, which is agree to our demands, and then we will engage with you. That's a reversal that I'm not sure I understand from a diplomacy perspective, right? Agree to, in the case of Russia, withdraw your support from Ukraine, which of course Russia is illegally invading, and then we will engage with you on arms control when Russia certainly has indicated historically an appreciation for the value of arms control and the value of risk reduction for themselves, that arms racing is not in anyone's interest, certainly not while they're waging a continuing illegal war. And so it's surprising to me that the assertion has been for purported indivisible security to say, okay, we will somehow concede to your demands just so you engage with us on arms control. It's a surprising thing. I also have to say, it's unfortunate that there are some in the political arena domestically that seem to say, China or others won't engage with you until they get to a certain level, so why do we keep trying? And it seems pretty un-American to say you should stop trying something because the other side tells you they don't want to engage with you. I think engagement is something we have to do, we should continue to do. It's our international obligation to work towards Article 6 obligations of the NPT, and we've committed to try to reduce risks in the global security environment. So I hope the political narrative that is somehow suggested that we in the arms control community and risk reduction efforts should just sit back and wait until folks are interested in engaging with us. I hope that political narrative can be, disbanded to a certain degree, because of course we should try to engage. We should try to prevent risk and prevent unintentional escalation and miscalculation, even if the environment does not support that, and especially when it's challenging for those engagements to happen. So those are two things that I'm a little bit surprised by.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. please raise hands, and then Anna will come around with a microphone and then introduce yourself. This gentleman back there had his hand up first, and we'll work our way around. And, well, actually, the gentleman back there had his hand, but he'll go second. No, go ahead. Go ahead. That's all right.
Thank you, and I'm one of those who thinks that the work that you and people like you do is extremely important, and hope that centuries from now people don't look back and say, we can't believe they failed. So let me ask, I read an article recently in which the author posited the reasons that the Russians have refused to pursue negotiations, and I'd be interested in your reaction to his three reasons. Number one, he indicated that the U.S. style has slipped into one because of its dominance in the worldwide media, so that it has a press conference set up for the day of the negotiations so that people like you can run over to the press conference, and the minute it's over, announce, well, the vile and malicious Russians have proven once again that they're vile and malicious. They failed every offer that we've given. Now write your stories, so that there's a deep distrust about the American sort of public PR approach to the whole thing. Second, that the American unilateral withdrawal from the ABM treaty was evidence that the United States was trying to trick the Russians into saying, we're going to build an Iron Dome in the United States, but you can't have too many missiles or too many MIRVs or too many something for our Iron Dome to work. So we're trying to trick you into reducing the number of offensive weapons you have so that it falls below the level where our Iron Dome will knock out anything you tried, and then it's game over, we win. And the third was that the American style of withdrawing from INF or ABM with a barrage of accusations the Russians are doing this, that, and the other thing is evidence that the United States discards these treaties whenever it no longer suits them. And their evidence was that somebody, I don't know who, implied or stated that the reason the United States withdrew from INF was because of China. And it was like slowing us down in dealing with China, so that the real reason we withdrew from the INF wasn't this smokescreen of Russians do this, Russians do that, but we wanted to beat up China, and it was no longer convenient. So we cooked up a lot of accusations against the Russians. So you had three reasons, all of which have to do with the fundamental notion that I think the moderator raised at the beginning, that is of trust. That trust was, so if you're going into a negotiation assuming the other side has a press conference set up the minute you walk out to blast you, or if you're assuming that people agree to treaties only as long as it suits them, and then they cook up excuses and unilaterally withdraw them. So I don't know what my real question is, whether it's one of why are we the trust level so low, or whether it's how do you respond to these 3 points. But it would be interesting to hear how you respond to them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely hear a lot, and I think all of us hear a lot in our jobs, a lot of whataboutism, right? About, China and Russia and many other states saying, but you did this, but you did that, or it's a narrative war, right? I mean, I think there's an equal concern on all sides that this is gonna be megaphone diplomacy, allegations, I think, of poor performance are on all sides. What we've been trying to say in the multilateral arena is, can we, for the moment, put this aside and figure out how we actually make positive progress going forward? Can we actually say, okay, we don't trust you and you don't trust us, and this is a constant cycle of distrust and escalation. How are we going to possibly move forward? And one of the things that we had in a good conversation, I think, that we said was positive repeatedly when we engaged with China in November, was at least putting our questions on the table and having them put their questions on the table and explaining the sort of nuances and the difference of perception. But it is a process. You can't just say, one, we've done it and we're done. I think we're trying to push forward in a positive way with certainly as many countries working with us as possible, and new partners as well. One of our, co-sponsors on the direct destructive ASAT prohibition was Brazil, right? Working with new governments and countries that care about making positive progress in the global stability and security environment and working towards ways where we can reduce distrust. And I don't disagree with you that there's allegations on both sides, that it's just gonna be a megaphone diplomacy engagement. I would argue that we've been trying to keep things in the diplomatic arena outside of the press to the extent we can, but often we feel we're responding to the other side bringing it to the press. I'm sure they feel they're responding to us. From my perspective, it's not actually that useful to focus on that. It could be more useful to say, what can we do to build something that would actually be in both of our interess, especially in this environment of a lack of trust. And I'm thinking of the risk reduction that we put on the table with China, the options to get to a better place, rather than focus on historical complaints and challenges, because that will just keep us right there, right? We're not making any progress. There's no way to break out of the cycle. So I understand that is what Russia has said repeatedly as to why it won't engage with us. I just don't think that's positive, and I don't think any of us should be allowed to say, well, you've done this historically, or we think you've done this historically, so we're just not going to do anything right now. It actually, I think, goes against our obligations to be responsible, nuclear weapon states under the NPT, but also our obligations to be a part of the international community.
This gentleman here, and then we'll go to this lady, and then Miles, and then Tong, and then this lady. Don't let me forget, all right?
Good afternoon, Madam Secretary. My name is Jake M. Goodman. I just wanted to, I had a couple questions, actually, and feel free to answer them how you will. But, well, first off, given the withdrawal from IBT scratch that. Focusing more on the NPT and the CTBT. Mm-hmm. How can we revise those for modern standards and ensure and mediate it? I am terribly sorry. Oh my God. I am sorry.
No worries.
I did not realize I was going to. Anyway, okay. Given the current status of the CTBT and the NPT, and the fact that the CTBT is not fully ratified by powers like the US, Russia, and China, how could we go about renegotiating or remediating a new nuclear treaty to ensure that there's no more proliferation of nuclear weapons, and we have a comprehensive test ban around the world between all nuclear powers? And two, in the very unlikely case that we do end up in nuclear war, what efforts are American cities or are we encouraging US cities and cities around the world to do in preparations in terms of like making bomb shelters more accessible to individuals with disabilities?
So on your second question, I will certainly defer in large part to our Homeland Security and Department of Defense colleagues and those that are working in the CBRN arena to sort of encourage their expertise in answering that question. To your first question, I would say we've been working through collaborative models in the international arena, such as the IPNDV, the International Partnership on Nuclear Disarmament Verification, and the CEND, creating an environment for nuclear disarmament to raise awareness of the challenges that we face in the multilateral arena on verification of disarmament, on risk reduction, to raise awareness of the challenges that we're facing in the NPT community, but also that we need to overcome to reach a world that the Biden-Harris administration very much wants to get to, where we can bring the CTBT fully into effect. So we are trying to develop a greater appreciation for the challenges that the NPT faces in these contexts, but also in broader conversations, right? Strengthening the international organizations that represent the communities that need to be strengthened, such as the IEA, such as the CTBTO, such as the OPCW, and trying to strengthen as well the Biological Weapons Convention, building up the mechanisms that would allow greater enforcement and greater, I think, approach toward effectiveness of the CTBT. I would say with respect to the NPT, we are very much actively working to strengthen, enforce, and ensure its longevity going forward. You know, I don't see right now a need for a change in the NPT. I think it has achieved much of what it set out to do. I think what we have to demonstrate is that we're taking our Article 6 obligation seriously, and it's challenging in this current environment, of course, but we are working in the P5 context to figure out how we continue to demonstrate that this is something that we need to achieve together with the other nuclear weapon states under the NPT. So there's a lot of things we need to do to continue to enforce and strengthen the NPT. I don't think modifying it is something that we are looking into at this point. It doesn't make sense to me. It instead needs something that we should support through other mechanisms. And on the CTBT, this administration has actively said we will work towards its entry into force, but we see all the challenges that we face to even get there, and that's what we're trying to raise awareness of in both the multilateral arena, the domestic audience, and with our partners and allies. So we certainly are not shying away from either of those issues, and I think we need to support both of them, but we need to work holistically to address all the challenges that they face across the board.
On the sheltering thing, I would say in American cities, the first thing would be to have shelters for homeless people to begin with, and then we could move on to bomb shelters, but we've got like a shelter problem in the country. This young lady here, and then Tong, and then Miles. Right there in the pink sweater, yeah.
I'm curious if you
I can't hear you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you think the reason why China is reticent to join risk reduction efforts is because they're courting, I read an article where they're courting a level of nuclear instability to hedge against a conventional war breaking out. And if that is the case, if that is the strategy they're going after, how do we encourage arms control negotiations or arms control?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I mean, I think I've heard various different reasons. I think the most direct comments that I've heard from them to the U.S. government is that, again, they don't want to engage with risk reduction with us while we're sort of engaging in activities they find destabilizing to the region, to their own security, while we're engaging in activities that they feel diminish their own security. So that is one of the things that has been in the mix, but I haven't had them directly say that to me. You know, I would say that risk reduction across the board is in all countries' interests. Again, we should prevent unintentional escalation and misunderstanding, miscalculation, and it's something that is in our national security interest as well as China's national security interest. And so, you know, putting aside conventional versus nuclear, strategic, non-strategic, I think the risk reduction efforts that we should engage in will hopefully prevent the conflict that I think would be borne out without that risk reduction. And I think, you know, it's something that we hope there is a growing appreciation for. I'm heartened that we have at least restarted some level of military communications with China. I'm heartened that there is certainly an appreciation in the international dialogue on risk reduction through, you know, their assertions of the value of no first use. I just think we need to engage to actually effectuate a greater understanding of where we're coming from to prevent misunderstanding and to actually maximize the effectiveness of that appreciation. So I'm not sure I directly answer your question, but I feel like, you know, engagement is the opportunity, putting aside whether this is, you know, a conventional or a strategic or a non-strategic debate. I think engagement to understand the perceptions and the narrative differences, I think, is crucially important.
Come.
Well, thank you so much. In terms of thinking about regulating behaviors rather than limiting numbers and capabilities, what do you think are the obstacles to prevent US and China or the P5 countries together to commit to a common sense principle of not having AI make nuclear authorization decisions. And if it is, secondly, if it's too hard to do arms control between US and China directly, how about cooperation to address third-party challenges? Do you think it is possible for the two countries to work together to encourage North Korea to move away from its doctrine of early use of nuclear weapons, or to encourage North Korea to adopt no first use, something China has been promoting internationally. And those measures perhaps would also serve Chinese interests of avoiding a nuclear war on its own doorstep. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. I think, the P3 has already said we should make sure to have a human in the decision-making loop with respect to nuclear weapons. And I know it's on the table for conversation in the P5 context, and I hope we could get to a P5 commitment on that. I think it's something that we should do. We can do it, and hopefully China and Russia see it the same way. With respect to encouraging risk reduction or a reduction in tensions with respect to North Korea, or even greater transparency or a change of sort of some of the saber-rattling narratives, I hope we could work together on that as well. I think it's something that is in our collective interest, and addressing the most destabilizing behavior and explaining why it's in nobody's interest for this to continue. I think it's something that we should be able to do together, and I'm hopeful that we will be able to do it together. Thus far, we have not been able to, but it's certainly something that we would be open to, and it should be something that is in all of our interests. So yes, I hope that those would be something that certainly the Chinese government and all of the P5 would be working towards.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Miles.
Hi. Good to see you.
Thanks, Anna.
So you mentioned a few times the issue of extended deterrence in Asia and Chinese concerns about that. So a couple questions related to that. So your boss, Secretary Blinken, and Secretary Austin are going to be in Japan next week for an extended deterrence dialogue. Now we have a Washington declaration with South Korea. Do we anticipate some similar kind of declaration with Japan? Or is there some sort of trilateral arrangement that we might get? The second question is, I don't know if you saw it yet, but there was a Foreign Affairs article by Amy Nelson, I can't remember the colleague, but that talked about that we should use the threat of nuclear sharing as leverage to get the Chinese to move towards negotiations. So I'd be interested in your opinion on that.
It will give you heartburn if you read it. I'm just going to tell you right now. I almost had a stroke, but go ahead.
Thank you. We have been pushing toward greater trilateral cooperation with Japan and the ROK. Since we had the really good conversation at Camp David, it's something that I'm very optimistic on. I think it's a really good development. I can't say right now if there's going to be additional sort of Washington Declaration-esque commitments out of this high-level engagement, but I think we are on a good path from our perspective as to strengthening, reassuring, and supporting our extended deterrence relationship with both Japan and the ROK, and growing appreciation for how our process works, how our system works, and their appreciation for, again, what has become cliche at this point, but is no less true, our ironclad commitment to their security. And I think making sure we can expand collaboration between Japan and the ROK as well for collective threats that they face much more acutely is also in our interest. And so I think continuing to elaborate on those relationships, continue to build on them, is something that's in all of our interests. And I look forward to seeing more of it going forward. I think we're going to have a very positive engagement next week. It's something that I think we're all looking forward to, and it's it's just a reflection of the importance of these relationships, the importance of recognizing the security challenges that our partners and allies face, and trying to make sure we can give them some level of assurance and confidence that we are there with them. I haven't read Amy Nelson's piece, which may prevent me from having to have a heart attack right now. I think sometimes it's very hard to utilize either messaging or deterrence efforts or even defense programming to achieve the effects you want to achieve. It goes without saying, it's an understatement, it's hard to do. And I think we have to be very careful that we don't have unintended consequences in many different arenas by trying to achieve arms control objectives through mechanisms that we don't know how the unintentional escalation could spiral. And so, again, I haven't read it. I deeply respect Amy Nelson and her work, and I will read it, but I'm just very hesitant to say how we can tell and how we know in advance the perceptions of others. It's one of our arguments, is that don't assume you know what the US will do if you attack us in a certain way, or if you make us feel destabilized. And we will promise not to assume we know what you will do, right? Neither of us know in many of these instances, is why we need engagement with China. It's why we need risk reduction across the board.
I think that was a great answer, and I just elaborate that I think one of the problems of that article, and it's a general problem, which is why I bring it up, is that you see it happen throughout this town now, and in publications. People draw from what they think happened in the Cold War, or in the ending of the Cold War in the 1980s, and in my opinion, I lived through it, a lot of times they're misreading or not fully reading that history, and they haven't really dug into it. And so there's and Mike Gallagher's done this in another foreign affairs piece, our policy should be regime change toward China, because that's what we did with the Soviet Union, and it won. We collapsed the Soviet Union. That's how we won Cold War. That's what we got to do with China now. And the reading of the history, or the understanding of what happened in all of those decades, including with the INF deployment, I would argue is very limited. And then it leads to the double problem. You identified the problem. You don't really know how it's going to play when you do that. But especially if you don't really understand how the thing worked that you want to be your model, you have a double problem. And that was my concern with that, but your answer was right. This lady here and this gentleman here, if we have time, I think we have time. We got 8 minutes, so yeah.
Hello, my name is Keisha Anderson. I heard you speak about building trust a lot with these two countries, and from understanding, I like history a lot, so understanding cultural diversities and the things that have happened within history, America does produce a lot of fluff to other countries. So instead of looking at it from a trust factor, maybe what are your opinions on looking at it from a respect factor? Because I can trust people to do their job, but I do not have to respect them. And within like China and Russia, they are very big on respect. So maybe stripping off all of the fluff and focusing on the core fundamentals of respect could help leverage and move forward more of figuring all of this nonsense out.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we often get caught up in semantics, right, of are we building trust? Are we building credibility in the systems? Are we building respect? Do we have respect? I think we have to be very careful, though, in some of our language choices, even with respect to translation, how these words are perceived, how the term competition is reflected in different languages. I agree with you. I think in the diplomatic arena, you obviously have to take the perception of the other country seriously, the concern that they have, the security concern. We hear a lot from Russia historically, but also from China, that we somehow don't respect their security concerns. I don't believe that to be correct. We respect they have this security concern. We may not agree as to why or how or in what manner we are responsible for it, but we should engage with them because we respect they have the concern. An equivalent point from my perspective and what I've talked about with other diplomats and colleagues around the world is you don't necessarily have to agree with the United States. You can have the perception that the United States has been wrong historically. You can say we don't even agree with your intel, or we don't agree with your presentation on this. But if you can agree that what we're talking about would be beneficial for the international security environment, right? Strengthening the Outer Space Treaty, reinforcing Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty that says do not place a nuclear weapon in orbit around the Earth. Let's try to take the positivity of what we're proposing, putting aside that it's coming from the U.S. that you disagree with, but support the initiative because ultimately we will all be safer, right? And I think it goes a little bit to your point, which is we put so much value in terms of relationships, relationship language, right? And it would be useful if we can step back and say, regardless of geopolitics, I respect you, you have this concern, and you should respect I have this concern. Let's talk about how we work together to make a more safe, secure, and sustainable global environment, and appreciate that we have these different perspectives. But I agree with you. In a system in the US where we actually do have a lot of turnover, much more turnover sometimes than many other governments, it's not about individual trust, it's about sort of predictability of the system, reliance in the capacity of those at the table to reflect what their government is doing, appreciation for the structures that has allowed that conversation to take place, and your ability to rely on that negotiation or conversation or dialogue to actually reflect values and perceptions of the government, right? So it's not really trust in sort of a traditional way of a relationship. It's predictability, it's credibility, it's enforcement. It's kind of the idea that you can rely on the architectures that we've set up. But certainly I do want to hear Chinese concerns. I want to understand their security challenges. I just think it's not realistic to say when you say indivisible security that it means you have to accept their demands that we stop doing something before we can engage. I think more realistic is to say, yes, tell me about your concerns. Let's talk through what is in the realm of the possible of working towards a better place where we can reflect our concerns to you, you can reflect your concerns to us, and we can sort of take mutually respectful steps toward a better, more risk-averse or preventive environment. And so I don't disagree with you. I think semantics sometimes, as is the case often, we trip ourselves up. Yeah.
Sir, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Mel Harding from the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. I'm kind of like really into this conflict resolution thing. There are so many terms lifted today. The unipolarity of the United States has been kind of like extant throughout the 20th century. And we have these bilateral relationships that you mentioned, and we have multilateral approaches to it. But today, I think, polylateralism, non-state actors, they're all figuring into all of these discussions. Very complicated matter. We haven't talked about India. We haven't talked about that theater as impacting, Modi's, conversation about overtaking China. So I'm just so confused as much as I like to study this stuff. I don't know where I'm going. I'm trying my best to understand it for my students. But your approach today, and sir, your questions have been fabulous. Thank you. Around trying to help us understand this very complicated set of issues. I don't really have a question. I want to compliment you on your diplomatic approach to this thing. The matter of listening, it's a lost art.
That was a great close. We didn't plan this. We've never met. I welcome you to Carnegie anytime, but I thought that was a great way to wrap up, and also to thank Mallory, because his remark about how you did this, I think, was right on, and welcome. And I hope whatever happens in the next 4 years, we're able to continue having officials like you and conversations like this with you all, because these issues aren't going away, so we're all going to have to do that. So if I may just thank you, and then thank you all for coming, and Mallory, thank you most of all.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for your really good questions and your participation.